when Jeannie's ready. I was asked tonight to just talk a little bit about what rewilding is and to just kind of give a little bit of an introduction again. I know some of you have probably heard about this before. Some of you may not know a lot about the topic. Then I thought I'd just throw in a few little items of data. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but if anyone asks you about it, why should we restore any areas, like what the Zales have done with their 300 acres, why should anyone follow suit? Well, there are many really good reasons, so I threw some of that in. And then we're going to end on is what you may not know is that we got a $5,000 grant to actually work on rewilding here in Northwest Iowa. And you're all invited to our shindig in early June, so we'll talk about that, where we kind of kick that off. Because of the closed captioning, you may not recognize it, but down here, that's the Big Sioux River there. That's a picture that was taken on my iPhone. Clarissa and I were walking. It's probably after 8 p.m. We went to Riverside Park last fall. And so what that is it was just flock after flock of Canada geese coming back from South Dakota to Iowa for the night. So they were telling us Iowa's where you roost. But apparently you go eat in South Dakota, I guess. So that's what they're telling us. Yes, what?
It's reconnecting your voice.
Been doing that for the last minute.
Oh, it's reconnecting. Okay. Uh-oh. Starting subtitles.
Again.
All right, it says it's listening. There we go. All right, so I've divided this into a couple different parts. And the first one, of course, is what in the world is rewilding? Well, I'm going to tell you a story. I was at the Sierra Club State Chapters meeting last fall, where I actually presented a little bit on rewilding again. And then Thomas Rosberg, who was on the state executive committee and teaches at Drake University, said, be careful with that word rewilding. And I said, why? Because, we have kind of a scientific definition for it. And he said, well, he was actually working with the landowner who said he wanted to rewild his farm. And how did he want to rewild his farm? Well, just let nature take its course. And he's trying to convince this landowner, the way that we've changed things, if you just let nature take its course, you're going to get a weed patch. And the problem is, the reason it's a weed patch is because they're going to be non-natives. It's going to be mostly non-natives. So when we talk about rewilding, we're talking about something that's very deliberate and planned. Planned to improve the ecology of the area. So, a formal definition, the process of restoring natural areas. We focus on what are called the 3 C's: cores, corridors, and carnivores. The idea here is we want to restore the ecological health of the land. Bring back biodiversity as much as we can to, quote unquote, the way it used to be. There's always a problem with deciding what is the way it used to be. How far back do we go for that? And do we have good data on what used to be there? But, be that as it may, actually you can't see the 3 C's here, so I'll just go to the next one. The idea here is that we want large natural preserves somewhere that are large enough that even, say, large mammals, large birds, and trees can have a good breeding population so that they can basically sustain themselves indefinitely. In ecology, we talk about the MVP a lot, but instead of the most valuable player, we're actually talking about the minimum viable population. And the minimum viable population is also calculated. There's a subset of adults of that population that will breed this year. There's always some adults that will not breed, and there's always juveniles that will not breed. You need a good population of breeding-aged adults in order to continue any population. So where would those cores be around here? That's where we're in trouble in Iowa, because 90% of Iowa, as you know, is farmland. 63% of Iowa in the summer is corn and soybeans, literally. And then the other 27% for all of the other, for pasture, for hay, for alfalfa, you know, the other crops that are grown. And as you can tell, in Iowa, richest soils in the world, we're certainly growing a lot of human food these days. So that's Iowa. So where do we put a large core? Those who have looked at this say, well, what about the Ozarks in Missouri? What about out to the Black Hills and maybe some of the prairies in South Dakota? What about north in, is it doing it again?
No.
What about north in Minnesota and possibly some areas of Wisconsin as well, boundary waters, that sort of thing. And Iowa, of course, is a land of rivers. And being a land of rivers, it can be a land of connections, a land of corridors for wildlife. And the corridors are key. As you know, we live in a time of climate change. Was it only a week and a half ago? It was 80 degrees.
Yeah.
And all plants and animals are essentially moving north in the northern hemisphere. And that's because they're used to a certain average temperature and they're trying to stay within their average temperature range, and that's moving north as everything heats up. So if we have these connections on the landscape, because we've broken them, then they can actually move from core to core, and that also means that you have breeding adults moving around the landscape as it used to be. If you don't have that, and you just have, you know, a patch of prairie here, and a patch of prairie here, and a patch of prairie there, you have 3 isolated populations, each of which is now more likely to go locally extinct. But if you connect them, now it's unlikely that any one of them is going to go extinct because they're juveniles will disperse, and they're exchanging genes between the populations. So they also maintain healthier populations as a result. The last C here is carnivores, and what you can't see anymore here is keystone species, right? Carnivores are so often keystone species, but the idea there is for proper ecosystem health and functioning, there are certain species that are necessary. Usually they're the large carnivores, and there are a lot of people who are active in this field who focus on carnivores as well, because the way they put it is, think about the most persecuted of our wild animals, right? When you settle a place, what do you want to get rid of? Let's get rid of the mountain lions. Let's get rid of the bears. You know, let's get rid of the carnivores. And so can we learn to live with carnivores on the landscape? This section I've already mentioned before, the altered landscape of Iowa. And here shows a little bit about what Iowa used to be. About 20% of Iowa's landscape was woodlands, right? And about 10% was wetlands here. So what you can't see here is, of the 20% of Iowa's woodlands, how much is gone? 80% of that 20%. And we've even shifted where they are, because a lot of Iowa's woodlands now are where the prairie used to be, on top of the hills.
It's not capturing.
It's not capturing? Oh, there we go. So the prairie used to be on top of the hills, and now we have a lot of woodlands on top of the hills, because that's where a lot of people built their farmhouses. And what do? Obviously, you want to have a little woodlot, especially to your northwest, because that's where all the cold comes from, right, in winter. And then those were allowed to grow. And over the last 100 years, that's where a lot of Iowa's woodlands have grown up. Wetlands, only 98% have been drained. So that's it. So wetlands are a little bit of an endangered ecosystem here in Iowa, but not quite like the prairie. 70% of Iowa was prairie, and just slightly over 99.9% of the prairie is now gone. Less than 1/10 of 1%. And we're very privileged here in northwest Iowa because of the Loess Hills. There are a lot of places that were just not good for row crops and not good for building buildings. The hills are too steep, and then the loess, of course, as you know, will erode very quickly. And so they were kind of left alone. And so this is the part of Iowa where we really have prairie reserves. So we have an opportunity out here. So that's nice. So altered land is one of it. Here's a way to visualize Iowa. So here's 28% of Iowa in everything except corn and soybeans for agriculture. This whole swath here, corn and soybeans. That's it. That's all it is. That's how much of Iowa is corn and soybeans. There was one study that I learned about, and I still have to figure out where it is and get a hold of it, but they were saying, how many counties do we need to have under cultivation in order to raise enough food just to feed ourselves in Iowa? And it was calculated out at about 4 counties. That's it, 4 of the 99. So if we just want to feed ourselves, then of course we could have some more counties to feed other people in the United States and some around the world. But I mean, if we took up 30 counties with agriculture, you could leave 69 counties of the 99 for other things. This 3% right here is incorporated land, so basically all of the towns, the cities. Then you have also 3%, slightly less land is roads. We have more area devoted to roads in Iowa than we do to natural lands. When you get down to natural lands, we're down here. And basically, this is the 2% that technically is natural lands, and then this is less than 1% are Department of Natural Resources lands. The problem with that is, of that 2%, 1% is road right-of-ways. So basically, the ditches along the roads that are designated as, let's have prairie there, that's natural land in Iowa. So we don't have much left. But what that means is, this is the place to do rewilding. There's no place really in the world that needs it more than Iowa. So another thing is, this has led, of course, to altered people. Altered land leads to altered people. I like these quotes, so I'm throwing them in. If you remember, about 2.5 years ago is, I think, when I gave my first presentation here about rewilding, and I actually used these quotes. We have internalized ecological impoverishment in our science, culture, and institutions. I just saw a discussion about bicycling and how certain town centers, and this is over in Europe, are banning bicycles in the town center. They are not banning cars in the town center. And eventually they got around to, I'm sorry, which is the one that if they hit someone would actually hurt them? You know, it's like, we just assume the car should be there. We do not think that maybe pedestrians and cyclists should be there, even though it's better for our health, and we know it, and it also makes the place much more livable and community-oriented. Well, here, we don't necessarily assume anymore that bison ought to be here. And you think about it, when the settlers came over, there were more than 30 million bison roaming the central plains of the United States and southern Canada. And where are they now? Grizzly bears used to come as far east as northwest Iowa. We used to have wolves here. We had a subspecies of elk all across Iowa. We definitely had white-tailed deer. I'm not sure if mule deer got this far east. We had, this amazing abundance of animals here, and we just assume it's normal now for animals to not really be here, right? Each generation assumes the nature they experienced in their youth to be normal, and that's, boy, is that true, right? I grew up, and I remember, my family's weird. My father is an only child, and my mother is an only child.
Wow.
So you guys grew up with aunts and uncles. I was like, why do you have aunts and uncles? But I had tons of great aunts and great uncles. And, whenever we had family get-togethers, then they would talk about the way something used to be, when they were young. And then it'd always be like, oh, that's gone now. Oh, I guess that's progress. And they would always say it that way. Oh, I guess that's progress. And I'm like, if that's, if you're lamenting progress, that's not progress. Like you valued what you lost more. And the problem is, I didn't grow up with that, and so I'm not even valuing what they lost. And kids today will just assume that not having prairie is normal. I've had to work with school children in middle school before and convince them that their lawns that their parents mow each day or each week are not grasslands. That's not what I mean. They're like, but it's land and has grass in it. Okay, technically you're right, but So, there's a whole new subfield of psychology called eco-psychology. And it turns out, and I'm sure you're not surprised to learn this at all, we are oriented toward nature. That when we can experience nature, we have lower stress levels. We're actually able to focus more. So if you have someone like in an office setting, and it's like you just can't focus, I just can't get this done or something like that. If you can just go out and even sit in a city park for a while, hear the birds, see a couple trees, that sort of thing, suddenly you're more able to focus your mind. It is much better for us. You've probably heard that if you're a post-operative patient and you can even see a single tree out your hospital window, you recover faster than if you can't. It's pretty amazing, but we are oriented toward the wild. I like this one. When we live in nature, we're less aggressive, right? So why not reduce aggression in society? And this thing turns off again. Starting subtitles. I'll go forward and see if it actually starts to pick me up again. It says it's listening. Is it listening?
It might be listening, but it's not writing.
It might be listening, but it's not right. Okay, let me turn it off. Wait a couple seconds.
Now.
Okay, now we'll see. So, let's put this in. There are psychological costs. We are more stressed. We are often quicker to anger, etc., when we are not surrounded by nature. Even just small little patches of nature, right? That helps us. And then, of course, you're not surprised to learn when you alter the landscape, you also alter the biodiversity of the area. Nice thing is we find out. So some of you are also active in Les Hills Wild Ones, right? And what is the motto? Saving the earth 1 yard at a time. Is that it?
Yeah.
And I love that motto because it's true. We find out, amazingly enough, even very, very small patches of you, instead of having a garden, you plant your little prairie garden next to your house or something like that. That actually supports local insect diversity, which supports local bird diversity. It actually, even small little patches of land help bring biodiversity back. The native insects are something that we too often don't focus on. The insects in North America and Europe have been in steep, steep, steep decline. And that's something that we should be very alarmed by, because you know there's the microscopic world, and that tends to exist in the soils and in the waters. And then there's the macroscopic world of the reptiles and amphibians and birds and mammals that we like and that we relate to more. Well, what connects them so that there's a flow of nutrients and energy between those worlds? It's the insects. And so when the insects decline, mammals decline, and birds decline, I mean, you know, amphibians decline, everything declines. And I know you're going to be shocked by this. And I tell it sometimes to my students this way because it's a little bit funnier way. It gets across easier. But in agriculture, of course, we put tons of pesticides on the land. Pesticides are designed to kill insects. I've seen the advertisements before where somehow these insect-killing pesticides will only kill the actual pests and no other insects. But it turns out, and it's just shocking, that when you put chemicals on the landscape that are designed to kill insects, all of the insects die. It's not just the pests. And even if we targeted like just the grasshoppers, well, then the praying mantises and other things that eat the grasshoppers also disappear because suddenly their food source is gone. So we either kill them directly or indirectly. This does not like me tonight. So, and then the last one, I thought I threw this in, and especially, Dottie, you should appreciate this, Douglas Talamy, right? If the insects aren't there, if the native plants aren't there, then the native insects aren't there. And if the native insects aren't there, what happens to the native birds? They're not there. What is it, about 80-90% of our migrating birds actually eat insects. So that's what they're coming back to eat. There we go. So there we go. So the birds are tremendously affected by insects no longer being there. So altered biodiversity, of course, it's a cascade of effects. Native plants, essential for native insects. Native insects, essential for native birds. So if the things that we like and love and want to have around our homes, if we want them there, but we don't like the bugs, well, we have to have the bugs anyway. Otherwise, it's not going to be there. That's the way ecology is. And then last, of course, again, preaching to the choir, altered climate. One of the things that I'll say about prairies in particular, prairies are fantastic at sequestering carbon in the soils. So we usually hear about forests. And I remember a previous governor of Iowa who, when asked about the environment, was saying, "Oh no, we're planting trees." And I said, "It's Iowa. Why are you planting trees?" Because he thought that was the way of getting it across. Prairies, what they do is, of course, they sink roots deep, as we know, and it keeps the soils in place. Well, roots, what's the basis of all life forms? Carbon, right? We're all based on carbon, so those roots are carbon growing into the soils. Every year, about 50% of prairie roots die, and then prairie plants grow them back. But when they die, that carbon is taken up by the microbial community of the soils. The carbon stays in the soils. It doesn't go back up into the air. So what happens in the forest, if you come in and cut down the forest or a forest fire, it all goes back up in the air. Whereas for a prairie, most of it's still sequestered in the soil. Even if a fire comes through, most of the carbon's still in the soil. So that's something that we need to sell to our lawmakers and everyone else. Carbon stays in the soil. And I apologize again, this thing is not like me and is just not going to work with me tonight. And that's that. So there we go. Prairies are a more reliable carbon sink because they put it right into the soil. So no matter what happens to the above ground prairie biomass, it's just me as I've been starting subtitles for a while now. No matter what happens to the above ground biomass, the carbon's in the soil. There we go. Reconnecting? Okay. All right. So, now, if we put that together, why do we need corridors? Well, species are moving in response to climate change. We know that. We know that prairies are also great for sequestering carbon into the soils. How are species going to continue to move? They come to Sioux City, or they even come to something like, think about I-80, right? That beltway across the middle of Iowa. Our highways have been called moving walls. There have been studies that even something as fast as a deer will not cross a highway unless there's less than one car every 30 seconds. Now think about that both ways. Less than one car every 30 seconds. There aren't many highways like that. Even out in Wyoming, there aren't highways like that. So they basically become moving walls for so much of our wildlife. There's some wildlife that absolutely will not cross them. And the problem with deer is studies have shown that they will approach the highway. Oh, car's coming. Okay, I'll approach it again. 40 seconds later, oh, there's a truck coming. And they get kind of skittish. And it's almost like you can see them just like us, kind of like, I gotta get across, I'm just going, And then they go and either cause a near accident or cause an accident because they're just so frightened the whole time. And the average deer vehicle collision costs us just over $22,000 a year. So that's with property damage. That's also with the potential medical bills that someone may have suffered from being injured in that accident. And obviously, it doesn't do the deer any good either. So, my conclusion is that rewilding's needed here. I know you're surprised by that, but... So, where do we find the wild in Iowa? So here I'm getting toward, okay, now we have this grant, and we want your participation, we want the participation of other environmental groups or groups that might be like-minded, of people who might be interested in this, farmers, landowners, people who own businesses in the tri-state area here. How do we get together and figure out what is wild in Northwest Iowa? That comes directly from the grant-making organization Be Wild, Rewild. That's what they want us to focus on. So problems are that about 95 to 96% of Iowa is private land. And as you know, landowners are fiercely independent and very, very proud of their land. You go to Europe, they have what's called a right to roam. And my brother and sister-in-law were able to go to Scotland a couple years ago, and they came back and was like, oh yeah, you can just walk around anywhere. You know, there's an old castle on someone's property. Just walk up to the castle and explore it, you know. It's the landscape. No one's going to harm you. Whereas, of course, in Iowa, or in the United States in general, so you better know whose property you're on, or you might be met with a mad person who has a gun on you. You know, get off my property. So what is wild here when not only do we not have much wild left, but also, I'm going to try to reconnect here again, but also 95 to 96% of Iowa is private land. So, this Be Wild, Rewild as an organization has a vision for rewilding Iowa. They have already funded a number of scientists and those who are experts in geographic information systems to look at the possibilities of creating corridors across Iowa and linking these corridors to the Ozarks, to the Boundary Waters, to the Black Hills, etc., so that those cores and those corridors can actually function again here in the Midwest. So the nice thing is I was able to correspond with them by email, and we wrote the grant and asked for the full $5,000. And so the idea of it is twofold here, as you can see: stimulate interest in rewilding in Northwest Iowa, continually get this idea out. And we thought that's their interest, but that also aligns with ours. So we worked with the executive committee here of the Northwest Iowa Sierra Group. And then the idea is create an action plan. Let's not just talk about rewilding, let's do something about it. It doesn't have to be that involved, but we want to do something about it. So our goal is hopefully on June 8th to bring people together at the Dorothy Pico Nature Center. We have rented, those two big rooms there. If you're familiar with where the Les Hills Audubon Society meets, it's basically those rooms. And I think they can fit, we were told, like 75 people, something like that. And to actually hold an event where we actually go over like examples of where to find what is wild, what is rewilding, actions that we could potentially do, that sort of thing. And the nice thing is, the grant will pay for lunch and also snacks and drinks. So that's the nice thing. We can say, come and you don't have to bring your food. We will have food for you because we are proposing to start at 10. 10 in the morning and adjourn by 3 p.m. So basically it's just lunch. And the idea here is that we'll have a summary of our definitions. What do we mean by wild, by wilderness, by rewilding, by nature, all this type of thing. There are some films that have been produced by the Be Wild, Rewild organization. And so I just copied here, as we say in our grant. Roger Ross Gipple is, I don't know if he's the head of Be Wild, Rewild, but he's certainly one of the leaders of the Be Wild, Rewild group. And these are short films, often 10 to 15 minutes, and we'll see probably 2 or 3 of them. And then provide examples of rewilding. So like the Agape Garden. That is actually an example, right? 20% of it is put into native lands, and the rest of it is a community garden, and that's also rewilding because it's getting people involved again on the land and getting them to actually not just help themselves, but help each other. Rebuilding community is part of rewilding. We have a couple examples of potential prairie restorations, and we're going to see if we can contact someone to talk a little bit about the state of our rivers. And as you know, in Iowa, the state of our rivers, not all that great. I just learned that Iowa is now the number 2 state in the nation for rates of cancer. And that has been linked to a lot of the nitrates that are in the water. So that's not good for us. Apparently the Cedar Rapids Gazette ran a series looking into that not too long ago. And it was a very good series. But then, break for lunch, and then we have breakout sessions. So basically we give examples of what rewilding is. Okay, what do we want to do? And then we come back together and talk about it and choose what we want to do. So what types of things could we do? Oh, well, you know, we could look at the nature reserves in the Lost Hills and say, can we start to connect those? And we just look at the potential for that. We don't actually have to build the corridors, right? Is it possible? Or are the landowners in between hostile? Is there any public land in between where we could go to a public agency and say, hey, turn this back into like a strip of prairie or a strip of native forest that species could actually traverse along? We could assess wildlife crossings, right? Where are the areas here in northwest Iowa where people are most likely to hit deer or other large animals and have significant property damage or even, you know, damage to the people themselves? What about creating stepping stones in Sioux City? A stepping stone is a small habitat patch. If you have like a little prairie garden or you plant native trees or something like that on your land, those are technically stepping stones. Our native species seek them out, the animals, so that they can get across the city. So they're not directly connected to each other, but basically they just have to go a short way across, you know, like a hostile environment to get to, oh, now I'm in this little prairie patch, I got some food and I got some shelter for a little bit. So what is the possibility for that? We could look at water quality. We could just look at, well, how would we approach landowners? How would we actually get landowners who, like if you say anything about, you know, being environmentalist or I'm from the Sierra Club, they would automatically view you as being the enemy. How do you get them to not view you as an enemy, and how do you get them to actually, you know, listen to you? Because usually we find out that we have very similar values. They're usually not hostile to the idea of putting land into conservation reserve, for instance. They're very proud of living in a rural area. So those are some ideas that we could work on, and then whoever's there is going to create a lot more ideas. And then the group as a whole will come together and choose the idea that they like the best, and then we'll figure out how to do that for the rest of 2024. So from June through December. And then in December, we get to write the report back to Be Wild, Rewild saying whether this worked or not. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. Here I just urge everyone to volunteer or to contact people you know, contact people in other organizations you might volunteer in, and say here's why we need to volunteer. Not just renew the landscape, not just create better homes for our non-human friends, but also to create better homes for us as well and renew our psyches and our spirits. And that's really it.